All right. So I am Emma Cooper. I'm the creative coordinator at Hope at Hand. Hope at Hand is a local nonprofit local to Jacksonville, Florida, um, that provides poetry therapy programming for at-risk youth all across North Florida. We also host Jack's Poetry Fest every April. This is our 10th anniversary, which is super exciting. So we have 100% free programming for the public, outdoor exhibits, hands-on activities, and then of course these virtual workshops that you guys are a part of. You can register for more events for the rest of April at jackspoetryfest.com/2025 schedule if you guys are interested in more workshops. And now I'm going to introduce our wonderful presenter for today, Jessica Q. Stark. So Jessica Q. Stark is an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of North Florida and the poetry editor for AGNI. Her poems have been published widely, and she is the author of two full-length poetry books, including Buffalo Girl 2023, which won a Florida Book Award. So thank you so much, Jessica, for hosting this workshop, and I'll let you go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Emma. Just a note that I've had a few people emailing me that's saying that they can't get in, just FYI.
Okay, I will look into it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for being here. I am dealing with a head cold, but we're gonna power through it. I'm so happy to be here. I teach, as Emma said, I teach at the University of North Florida, and I teach a variety of classes. But I also teach, especially towards the end of the term, which I'm facing right now, I teach workshops like this, where it's more of a practical workshop and thinking about how to break into publishing and how to think about the parameters of publishing. I've taught this workshop as well for poets and writers and a number of other poetry organizations nationally. So it's one of my loves because I feel like in poetry, especially in some regards, the path to publication isn't really talked about. And it isn't really kind of made clear how to go about that. So the purpose of this workshop is to really elucidate that kind of journey for you in whatever iteration that might take, as well as save a lot of time, especially towards the end of this session. I'm going to save a lot of time for just a kind of back and forth question and answer. I'm going to provide you a whole lot of information, and I might talk for quite a bit, more so than I do in my more creative generative workshops. But that's just to sort of hopefully give you enough context in which to sort of form your own questions. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat though. So as I'm kind of talking, I would love if you have questions that pop up in context to what specifically I'm referring to or what I'm talking to. I'll keep an eye on those and I can kind of answer them along the way. If you have kind of like big picture questions, like, you know, how do I start publishing, things that are more big picture, I'll ask that you just save those for the end because I am going to leave enough time to get to plenty of those questions. I'd like to start the session though with just a general question of what is your interest in publishing? What's your experience in publishing? I'd love to hear any voices too out there. Feel free to use the chat if that is not available to you. But if you're feeling amenable to it, I'd love to see some faces and hear some voices before I start talking at you with a lot of different information. So what's your interest in publishing? What's your experience in publishing? Where are you coming from? I'd love for anybody to jump in before we get started here, just to kind of give a little bit of a sense of who's in the room.
So if you do want to share, you can indicate that by raising hand, and then Jessica will have to ask
Oh,
you
awesome.
to mute.
Okay, great. I'm looking.
You can also type it in the chat if the raise hand feature isn't working for you.
Okay, I just muted some people. Hey, Anne.
I can speak. I have published some poems in online journals, and I just now self-published a chapbook of
Great.
fools. I've sent out a lot of stuff and I get very few nibbles.
Yeah, that's the lay of the land. Thank you, Anne. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute Bonnie. How are you doing, Bonnie?
Hey, I'm doing fine. Um, I just wanted to say that happy to be here. And I just published my first book of poetry in
Fantastic.
January,
Yay.
and I used Warren Publishing, and it was a great experience for me. I learned just a ton
Beautiful.
through the process.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bonnie. Where are you coming from?
I'm in Houston, Georgia, which is near Gainesville, Atlanta area.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm gonna I'll simultaneously read a lot of the great contributions in the chat, but I'll give you a little bit of my background. So I think I got a little bit from my bio, but the main kind of editorial role that I play right now is that I'm an editor for Agni, which is a magazine based out of Boston University. It's I've been working there since 2019 as their poetry editor with a large poetry editing team. And it's one of the most competitive poetry magazines in the nation, if not the world. And I'll share a little bit about our statistics in just a minute. So that's my main kind of editorial role that I've been playing. And I can't really downplay like how interesting this experience has been for me in terms of, lifting the curtain on what that feels like to get the submissions, but it's also information for you because it's kind of humbling to put yourself out there and try to publish, but once you kind of get on the other side, it's incredible how few publications that we can actually accept. So we receive currently around 15,000 submissions per year, and 40% of that is in poetry. 40% is in fiction and 20% is in nonfiction and hybrid. Our acceptance for poetry is less than 1%. It is, to be precise, it's 0.3% of all submissions. So you can imagine the amount that we are able to publish is just so small. And in order to keep up with that, I read very quickly. I have to, in order to get through everything, I try to read carefully but quickly and efficiently. We are a fee-based magazine, so we do charge submission fees in order to read, and that was a new thing that was instituted because we needed to restrict. We were getting 25,000 submissions, and it just was not. We were not able to get through everything, even with our largest team. A lot of our editors have, including myself, full-time jobs beyond the editorial positions that we hold. So logistically, it was really necessary to limit that pool. But I hope this could be, I guess, it seems kind of deflating in some ways to think about a publication that only takes 0.3% submissions. But I also feel like it can kind of be a little bit liberating in some ways, in that these things aren't personal. These decisions aren't personal. They can't be in some ways, because I'm reading about 250 to 300 poems a week, and I have been for the past 6 years. And you can imagine the efficiency in which I have to work through submissions, and a lot of it is really intuitive. And I'll talk a little bit towards the end of the session about. I often get the question of, what do we look for? What do I look for? What does the team look for? And I'll contextualize that quite a bit. But I want to give you just the kind of overview of just how selective some of these publications are, and to keep that in mind when you're kind of putting yourself out there. We have wide reading periods, September 1st to May 31st for Agni. And the majority of our work is unsolicited, which means that some magazines out there, which is also, this is not super common knowledge, some magazines out there will actually solicit most of their work for publication. So they will hand select and reach out to a number of poets that they have in mind in order to craft a magazine that they envision. You can imagine the kind of ethical problems with this is that It's not really amenable to finding new poets. It's not really amenable to saving space for new poets. And it gives very, very little space for those who are in, quote, the slush, i.e. those who just submit to the magazine during their open periods. Agni prides itself on really saving an ample amount of space. I'd say about 95% of our submission or our publications are unsolicited. So we do not solicit for work. We basically just use who has submitted to us to consider. And that's actually kind of a unique thing. I also have in the past judged some book prizes. So I've judged for Trio House Press in 2024. I also judged a few years for the Tupelo Quarterly Book Award, as well as BOA Editions and their book award, which is happens to be my publisher for poetry. Currently, I'm also the faculty advisor for Talent Review, which is a student-run literary magazine in affiliation with UNF. So I'd love to kind of talk to you about, before we get up into the strategy of publishing, I think it's really important, especially right now, to think about why do we publish in an age when you can pretty economically go to like a copy store, or you can get a pretty nice printer and print out your own things. Like, what is the purpose of doing all of this? Like, what is the purpose of, all of this labor that goes into landing a publication somewhere? And I want to say there's just a number of different reasons, and I'm just going to outline a few. It's an incredible networking opportunity, first and foremost, to meet and work with editors. Editors are, for the most part, are working artists in my experience, like myself. And what you're doing when you're submitting, when you're publishing, is you're actually entering a conversation, a much larger conversation than your local community, of what poetry is up to. And I think that's incredibly exciting. In addition to that, publications, of course, help you build a reputation and build an audience, especially in preparation if you're looking to place a larger manuscript with a publishing house. Gathering publications is a really good way to build your kind of writerly reputation before you pitch your book to a publishing house, or before you put your name in the hat in terms of applying for contests or book prizes. That's just generally the kind of way that people have gone around about it. So those are some really key features of pursuing publication that are really worthwhile as well. It is a form of feedback, right? If you're trying to submit, you've been trying to submit the same batch of poems for years, and people just keep turning it down, that's feedback. I know it's hard to absorb that, but maybe it's an indication that you need to go back and develop it further, or you need to spend a little bit of time reading and figuring out what can I do to kind of craft my submission. Maybe you need a completely new submission, but all of this is feedback. And that's something I really encourage people to take to heart, in that a rejection is not a personal condemnation of you. It's just feedback. It's just feedback, like we get in workshops. And that I just want to say a little bit of a note of on self-publishing. I am a self-publisher as well, so I do both the professional route of landing pieces in publications, of landing books in kind of small press distributors nationally. But I really enjoy what self-publishing can do as well. So self-publishing is a really nice way to see your work in print, obviously, but it's also a nice way to build kind of immediate community in your geographical location. But we have to admit that there are some limitations, right? The exposure is going to be a little bit limited. Your audience is going to be a little bit limited. It could be prohibitively expensive too, to do your own kind of publication means. I feel like in some ways it restricts your conversation with a wider range of poets, right? So all to say that I participate in DIY and self-publishing techniques. I think they're really exciting. And it's an interesting way to sort of like build community within your local geographical location. But we have to admit that it can be somewhat limited, and it depends on what you want out of poetry. It depends on what you want out of putting your work out there, and it depends on like your stakes, basically, which is a very personal thing. So I say to myself, like, why not both, right? Like, why not both? Why not self-publish some work, but then also work hard to enjoin the kind of conversation, the national kind of conversation around poetry, which is really exciting for me. And it's why I'm doing this. So I invite you to kind of say, why not both as well? For the purposes of this workshop, I'm mostly talking about that kind of professional publication, but I did want to give a little bit of a caveat, and I'm happy to take any questions about that towards the end of the session. So once you're preparing to submit work for publication, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of research. So what do I mean by research? I mean reading. I mean reading. And in this day and age, we have so much accessibility to different kinds of online journals that aren't fee-based, that aren't subscription-based, that you can completely access online. There's a number of electronic journals that I'd love to mention. So there's the Adroit Journal. I'll actually put some of these in the chat. Adroit Journal, there's the Boiler, there's the Offing, there's Electric Literature. So all of these are electronically based. I'm trying to type and speak at the same time, electronically based journals that you can access for free. There's also Swim, which is based in South Florida. Slope, there's Blackbird. Anyways, you get the point. You can also do your own search and find a number of other literary journals that present their curations for free. And if you're not kind of familiar with some of these, in prelimination or sorry, my head cold is like disrupting my ability to articulate. As a preliminary move to preparing your own route to publication, I would read as widely as possible. Read literary journals, just in terms of what's being published right now. And also it gives you a really good sense of like the journals that you might want to submit to. If a good indication of that is if you're really vibing and you really like what they're putting out, that's usually a pretty positive indication that you should submit there in the future. So read, absolutely read. Read recent publications, right? In the last 5 years of poetry that's been published. It's just a really good way to kind of acclimate yourself to like what the kind of conversation is right now and what's being published right now. There's also some interesting ways to access this in terms of even beyond the electronic journals that don't charge. So one thing that I did, this is like a little pro tip that I did to make subscription-based magazines more accessible. So I gathered with 3 other graduate students, and we were all very broke at the time, and we were like, we want to read this stuff, but we can't afford it. And each of us, myself and these 3 other graduate students at the time, would each pick like one magazine to pay the whatever $15 or $20 yearly subscription to get it, and then we would just all share. So in that way, we all had access to 4 magazines instead of 1. So that's just like one kind of like communal pro tip that I have participated in myself in order to access more very recent literary magazines. Okay, let's see. Another thing about doing research is, in 2025, there is more of a kind of onus to be present and active on social media. Blue Sky is a great place to do that. There's a lot of literary journals that have really robust present social media presences. And I know that some people balk at that, but at this point, it's also a really good way to acclimate and familiarize yourself with what's being published. There's also a lot of links to things like this, but there's also a lot of links to events or readings, free readings that can be accessed online, which is just another way of doing research and getting more information of the contemporary poetry landscape. There's also a lot of ways, and doing all of this work is really important in terms of familiarizing yourself with the varying different tiers of journals. So sometimes when you start publishing, I've been working with students in creative writing for the past 13 years or so, and one of the kind of greenest mistakes, and a mistake that I did myself when I was starting out, is to start out hot off the gate and be like, I'm going to submit to the New Yorker. I'm going to submit to Poetry Magazine. And there's just, the odds are so stacked, and that there's steps that you can kind of take before those really, really large and extremely competitive and sometimes fully solicited magazines, right? Like, so I would just really familiarize yourself with the varying tiers of journals. Check who they're publishing. If they're only publishing people that won Guggenheim's and won the National Book Award last year, you might, and you've never published, and you've never published a poem, you might need to temper your expectations, right? And start a little bit slower in terms of where you're kind of directing your energy, because that's just going to be leading to disappointment, and maybe you're not ready for that. So where can you find open calls? A bunch of places. So there's a website called, Rachel, thank you. Yeah, I know, I love that too. Where to find open calls. There's a website, if you Google, oops, I just direct messaged somebody to Jessica's iPhone. I meant to put that in everyone. New Pages, I'm going to put this in the chat. New Pages is an online directory for different open calls. Also, Poets and Writers has a free listing that you can kind of peruse and access, which I found really helpful, especially when I was first starting out. Another one that's really interesting, if you Google Heavy Feather Reviews where to submit, this is an interesting free source, because not only does it list different publications, literary magazines that are looking for, say, standalone poems, but it also lists open calls for chapbooks, and it also lists open calls for full-length collections. So this final resource could be really a good place to bookmark and revisit, especially along your journey as you develop towards hopefully a full-length collection, if that's what your goal is. Again, I mentioned social media is a really good place unexpectedly to find open calls. I see open calls there all the time for chapbooks or standalone poems. So that's a good place to familiarize yourself with that as well. All right, let's see. So once you've familiarized yourself and read more in terms of contemporary poetry and what it's up to, you'll probably turn to preparing your own submission. So I just have a few tips for, I've delivered these to my students, but just generally people that are preparing to submit, is you really want to just put your best foot forward in terms of this stuff. One thing, a series of different steps that I took before I started publishing was I joined a workshop. So I didn't really go to school for poetry. I went to school for writing about poetry, but I didn't really go to school to like learn how to write poetry. So for me, I really had to make those communities ad hoc. And it did help that these scholarly communities sometimes contained practitioners as well. But I gathered with friends to develop a workshop or a writing group that would meet, say, like once a month or so, and we would share each other's work and give each other feedback. And that I felt was one of the most important ways for my own development. for me personally, more so than a class. So I would suggest before you submit, do something like that. Do something in which you're getting feedback, especially if you don't have access to an institution or a class specifically geared towards writing and publication and giving feedback and workshops, which a lot of us don't, right? But you can gain these kind of methods of feedback in other ways. Very simply finding writers, joining local writing groups, finding writers online via social media. There are ways, there are means to sort of find writers that you trust. I would also suggest maybe keeping it a little bit small in terms of your working or writing group, so you can kind of trust and develop with these select people that you found. If you don't have access to that, you know, asking family or friends is a really good way to just kind of get a read on your stuff. Of course, this is not going to be as honest maybe as like a dedicated writing group with other writers. But I would suggest anything before just submitting your stuff out there without any feedback whatsoever. Revise, 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 and do copy edit for any proofreading errors, especially in your submission. This seems obvious, but as an editor, you know, there's definitely things that come in where I'm like, wow, this person didn't even copy read anything. You know, there are errors and punctuation errors all over the place, which is just not a good look. It kind of just makes it seem like you're not taking your work seriously, right? So why should the editor take your work seriously? So in terms of the cover letter too, the cover letter is another interesting place. So although that the cover letter is not always read, keep in mind, while these are not always read, they are a rare opportunity to kind of contextualize both you as an artist and your submission. So unlike like a work cover letter or something that you're applying for a job, those cover letters can be quite extensive. But what I mean by a cover letter is for a submission is usually quite short, right? It's usually like, dear editors, I'd like to submit this poem, this poem, this poem for consideration. Below is a bio for your review. I appreciate your time, sincerely, your name. And then your bio, you'll have a third person bio that's very short, probably about 3 to 4 sentences, that kind of highlights your any previous publications, any awards that you've received, any training that you've done, any editorial experience that you have. And if you don't have any of those things, you can still add a bio that kind of contextualizes your work, your interests, you know, what your poetry is up to, etc. That's, so don't get too like discouraged if you're like, well, I don't have any of those things. You can still kind of provide a bio that's short and eloquent and kind of gives a snapshot to the editor of who you are and what your work is all about. In terms of the cover letter in general, I would suggest to sort of keep it, like I mentioned, keep it concise and relatively brief. Sometimes authors can provide a very brief contextualization of the submission, but I really want to emphasize the brevity of all of this because I think just like keep in mind the weariness. I'm reading 250 to 300 poems a week. Keep in mind the weariness of these editors, and also that these editors have probably full-time jobs on top of this. So you're just really like, you want a snapshot, you want to get it fast. One of the best advices that I've ever received about anything in terms of being an artist is be brief, be brilliant, be gone. Just keep repeating that in your mind in terms of contextualizing your work and contextualizing who you are as an artist to these editors. So again, but like make sure it's proofread, even the cover letter. Again, they're not always read, but sometimes they are. So use all of this as an opportunity to kind of frame and contextualize yourself. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the process and grind, the very practical process and grind of the publication process, which it is a grind. It is a grind. And you're kind of like going against the numbers here, as you could see from even just the statistics that I shared with you in my own publication that, oh, I have a question. I'm not clear when you would send a cover letter for a single poem or more for a chapbook or manuscript? Great question, Evan. So generally speaking, for when you want to place a single poem, usually submission guidelines will ask you to submit anywhere from 3 to 6 poems for consideration. And usually they'll pick up maybe one, right? Maybe they'll pick up two, but you'll generally send out in batches. So 3 to 6 batches of poems. And the standard is generally if you're submitting in Submittable, which is the main kind of format for submitting submissions now to literary magazines, there will be a box for a cover letter, or there will be an option to include a cover letter. So if that option is available, I absolutely encourage you to send that cover letter. Again, it doesn't have to be really extensive. It could be super brief, like I mentioned. For a chapbook or a manuscript, same thing goes. So the chapbook or the manuscript, for the most part in poetry, those are run by usually contests or open reading periods. And they actually look pretty similar to it'll be usually in the same kind of submission portal. Submittable is a really common one, but it will have like a window for your cover letter. If I was setting out a chapbook or a full manuscript, I would provide maybe one sentence at least of contextualization of what the chapbook or manuscript is doing thematically, conceptually. I think that's really important. But again, same advice goes here in terms of the cover letter for a chapbook or a manuscript. You really want to be brief. You really want to be succinct and concise in framing who you are as an artist as well as your work. So same advice for both of those things. But thank you, Evan, for that question. So going back to the process and grind of pursuing publication, this is one piece of advice that I received that I found kind of unique when I was beginning to do this process, is the 5-5-5 rule. So basically, what this organization is basically, so you have your 3 to 6 poems that you want to get published, right? What I would suggest is, after you've done your research and kind of have more of a lay of the land of these different kind of tiers of literary magazines and which ones are really competitive and which ones are maybe more approachable, I would suggest identifying 5 like reach magazines. So maybe magazines that aren't necessarily like the New Yorker, but magazines that you think like maybe, I've been reading it for a while, my work resonates here. I would love to be in this magazine. I would identify 5 of those reach ones. Maybe it's like a little bit above you think your grade. That's okay. We can be a little bit ambitious here. So I would identify 5 reach magazines. I would identify 5 mid-tier magazines, or magazines that like, you're like, okay, yeah, like this is, I can probably get in here, and 5 lower tier magazines in which you're like, okay, this is a magazine that has a generally kind of, it seems like it has a whole big pool, and they're a little less stringent than some of the higher tier magazines. And then I would identify those 5 lower tiers. How you would move through your publication strategy in some ways is you'd start with the 5 reach magazines and you'd submit to all of those 5 the same poems. This is called a simultaneous submission, and that's okay to do, just as long as you tell them if it's been picked up by another magazine. So I'd start there with the 5, wait to hear back, either a rejection or hopefully an acceptance. If you get all rejections, natural, normal, fine, then you're going to move down to the 5 mid-tier magazines. And again, same thing here, wait for an acceptance, hopefully, fingers crossed. If it's 5 strikeouts, then you're going to move down to the 5 lower tier magazines and blast out to those 5. And in that way, you're not kind of like disappointed or you wish that you had gotten into a better magazine, etc. Now, if you're just starting out, like completely starting out, you've never had a publication before, you're going to want to start in those kind of like lower tier magazines. What do I mean by that? Things that are limited in terms of their pool. So student-run magazines, not always, but sometimes they are a little less competitive to get into. So that's somewhere to start. Regionally based magazines or zines are also a good place to start, as maybe they're restricted in terms of their demographic of who they want to publish. So only like Florida-based poets, or only like poets from Jacksonville. That would also be a really good kind of low stakes, lower tier place to start, and to just sort of like begin being a part of the conversation of publishing in general. So that's like where I would start if I was just starting out, is kind of start accumulating these sort of lower stakes publications, and then you can kind of move into this 5-5-5 rule in which you're kind of strategizing around getting into these higher ranked magazines. Again, just to sort of accumulate more exposure, but also join this robust kind of conversation of poetry that's going on in a national, international level, which is, again, my goal. And I hope that some of you here share that as well. And just remember that if you completely strike out from all of these, is that that's just feedback. That's just feedback. That's not like a personal condemnation. Everybody gets rejections. I've gotten a million rejections. That is the name of the game, and it's feedback. It's feedback to keep reading, to keep writing voraciously, you know? Okay, thank you, Deborah. Welcome. No worries, no worries. Okay, so, and then if you get an acceptance, just a reminder that the protocol, the etiquette is to withdraw from all of the other publications that are still under review. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to keep it moving. I'm going to try to spend at least 15 minutes with just question and answers at the time, but I still have some, you know, some tips for you before I stop completely lecturing at you. Okay, so embracing rejection and rejection tiers. Like, just remember that the numbers game is kind of against you. Rejection is part of the process, and that it really, this whole stuff kind of really requires patience. It's not personal. If anything, curation is a form of deep love, right? Curation is a form, let's repeat that together. Curation is a form of love. And this is feedback for you, just in terms of how to develop towards writing your best poetry, right? A tiered rejection, not a lot of people know that literary magazines often have different tiers and different levels of rejection, including the magazine that I work for. So if you get so not all rejections are created equal. If you get a rejection that says something along the lines of like, this wasn't for us, but we really encourage you to try us in the future, that is a really good indication that that is a tiered rejection, or a higher tier of a rejection. Which if I got something like that, I would absolutely, you know, go back to the drawing board with maybe a different set of poems and try that publication again. It's a good indication that you were pretty close to acceptance, or at least closer than the norm. So I would try that publication again. That's called a tiered rejection. A form rejection is generally very blanket language. It's usually pretty terse. It's usually has no personalized information in it with regards to your submission. So that's just kind of like the general rejection. But the tiered rejection, or the custom rejection that actually names something in your work or encourages you to resubmit, that's a higher rejection. So just keep that in mind, that if you receive that kind of rejection, it's actually a vote of confidence to maybe try that publication again. In terms of AGNI and our statistics, 85% of our rejections are form rejections, and 10% are those better tiered rejections, and 5% receive custom letter rejections. So really specifically naming the poem and what we liked about it, but why we specifically couldn't take it. I wanted to share that with you because I think that's interesting information that not a lot of people know. Okay, so what do editors look for? I've got this question quite a bit in terms of AGNI. So again, AGNI is housed at Boston University. It's known among readers around the world. And the writers group PEN distinguishes it as, quote, publishing important new writers early in their careers, many of them translated into English for the first time. And that's true, we do put a pretty heavy emphasis on translation and looking for translations. But we also really prize publishing new writers and publishing writers that aren't, I guess, known in the literary landscape yet. When I ask this question, though, to put it kind of simply, I look for urgency. I look for urgency. So more so than like a poem that shows me that this person went to a whole lot of fancy schools, or like this person knows how to write a sonnet. Like, I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in like the feeling, the intuitive feeling that this poem needs to be published right now. And I know that's kind of like a flimsy, whimsy receptacle of a guideline, but it's the best way that I can describe how I choose from a pool of writers that are incredible. Like, we get the best writers submitting to us that are at the top of their craft, that have these forms of mastery on poetic craft, but that's fine and that's fancy and that's nice. I'm looking for something that I feel like needs to urgently to be read by other people. So I want to share that with you, just in case you have that question too, of like, what are you looking for? I'm looking for, if we have such a small amount of space to publish, I feel like every single piece should feel absolutely urgent and necessary to be read by other people. Poems that challenge how we look at the world, poems that challenge how we understand ourselves, poems that challenge what poetry can do is what I look for, in short. Okay, I've been accepted, now what? This really, varies from publication to publication. Sometimes there will be a back and forth editorial process, and it really varies by the magazine. Agni is pretty hands-on in terms of making suggestions, minor suggestions, to make the poems their absolute best work. But for the most part, I think a lot of in my own publishing experience beyond Agni, for the most part, if you're accepted, you're in. So that's just what to expect when you're publishing. And it also, I should say, one thing is that the professional publishing process is super, super long. So you might get a poem picked up and published, and it might not come out for 6 months. And that's just, patience is the name of the game with this kind of thing. Okay, I do want to save some time I have a little bit more, but I actually want to prioritize some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions that kind of popped up in this long talk, I apologize that I've been talking so much at you. I'd love to have more of a dialogue in terms of meeting your needs and what you want kind of clarified, because this was kind of a lot. And you can feel free to put it in the chat, or you can feel free to just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Would love to answer any questions. I'm just surveying. Okay, I always get rejection letters that say, we really enjoyed your writing, but I can't tell if it's a form rejection or not. That's hard. I mean, I would take that as a tiered rejection. I would take that as, because I don't really think that's part of, usually the form is, we really enjoyed your writing. That's certainly not in the form for Agni. So I would think that's a tiered rejection, like a higher rejection. Yeah. Patrick, I think that's the Patrick Morgan I know. I'm not sure. Confirm if it is. How dangerous is it to share unpublished work on online platforms in terms of people stealing? That's really interesting. You do have to be pretty careful about that. As well, I think a lot of magazines are fairly strict about it not being published anywhere. So posting your unpublished poem on social media is actually technically published. So just be careful of that if you're sending out poems for publication consideration that you haven't posted it on social media, or just go back and delete it before you submit it for publication consideration. I mean, in terms of like, there's always the possibility of being stolen from in this day and age, unfortunately. That's kind of like more of a pretty loser thing about them than it is about you. So like, I mean, if you identify it, I would absolutely like, you know, make some screenshots and do what you need to do. But I wouldn't get too like, that's their work, not yours. Let's see. Was loving the feedback. That is what rejection is. I've always written thank you for the rejections. Yeah, not, I know it, they can feel very personal, and I have been there, you know, but they tend to not feel personal after a while, after you've been at it for a while. Okay, yay. We have, hi, Darlene. How's it going? I'd love to hear your voice. I feel like I'm just talking at the void. So thank you for
Oh no,
breaking up my voice.
this is great. I love a good informative lecture. I love it. Thank you. Um, so I'm new to all of this, right? I just started writing like 4 years ago after I retired. And I'm just putting myself into everything writing.
Yeah.
So I have my first poems. I've written so many poems. So I have a book that I have together, and I'm going over it and different things. And so I'm would like to have it published either by the end of this year or mid next year. But should I be really pushing to get work published in like a magazine first before I publish a book?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's generally the protocol. There's always, in all forms of art, right? There's always exceptions to the rule, but again, getting standalone poems published is a really good way to just sort of establish your reputation as a poet. That can only help you in terms of placing the manuscript as a whole. So yeah, Darlene, absolutely work on that. But again, it's a game of patience, right? It is an absolute game of patience.
So,
Go ahead.
So with that the deadline that I have to get the book published at the end of the year without having, I mean, I did have 2 poems published in a anthology book that was a part of my writing group. But that deadline is, should I like keep pushing for that deadline?
Who created the deadline?
I did.
Oh, okay.
So
Then you can uncreate the deadline.
But is that like a good thing to do, or like should I wait until I've published something else in a magazine or something, or can I just publish my book without?
Oh, well, I mean, this kind of goes back to my comments in the beginning of the workshop, in that it's really like it's a personal decision in terms of whether you want to publish professionally or whether you want to self-publish. I think if you're wanting to self-publish something, it's a little less of the protocol to go about, like, you know, all of these steps to sort of establish yourself and familiarize yourself with the literary landscape. But again, this is a really personal decision of like, I guess you have to ask yourself, Darlene, like, why do you want to publish? You know, like for me specifically, like I love being a part of this like larger conversation, and I love kind of like interacting and communing with other writers on this like larger landscape. But I also do a lot of self-publication in that, like, I want to, like, you know, give my friends a little piece of my heart that I've been working on. So I'll just say it doesn't have to be either or. But I think for you, Darlene, I would dwell with like the question of like, well, why do I want to publish? And if it's because you kind of want to build this like ongoing conversation with other poets and community on a larger scale, then I would say you got to have patience. You got to place some of those poems before you put out that book. But if that's not important to you, no disrespect, that's not important to you. Then you don't, that kind of onus kind of falls away. So it really depends on you.
So I don't want to take up all the time. I'm just going to ask one more question. But so would me not being published anywhere stop a publishing company from looking at my book? How important?
I think it's fairly important, I will say, to be completely honest. It's fairly important. I think it would be pretty rare for someone to pick up a manuscript for like a professional small press publishing to pick up a manuscript of a poet that's never published a poem in a literary magazine. And that's
Okay.
not to say that like that it's not good or something. It's just that sometimes those placing single poems is a really good barometer of your craft and what you're cooking,
Mhm.
so yeah, just keep that in mind. Yeah.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you. Okay. Any other, great, let me see, we got one other voice and then I'll jump back to the chat in the next few minutes.
Thank you for the talk. It was very helpful.
Thank you.
I'm just asking about the chapbooks and manuscripts. I'm working on a manuscript and I'm thinking, should I aim to write a chapbook first or is okay? And that's just a chapbook is just a shorter collection than a manuscript because I was told a manuscript's about 90 poems or 90 pages. So a chapbook should be just half of that.
Yeah, I can break that down. So generally the kind of protocol that happens these days, but again, with the caveat that there's always exceptions, is first poets start with placing standalone poems, and then they place a chapbook. So a chapbook, I could teach a whole class on the history of the chapbook, but right now I'll focus just on now. Chapbooks are around, they can be anywhere from 15 to 40 pages. 15 to 40 pages, so it's a pretty wide length. And I love chapbooks. I think they're such weird little objects, but they can be thematically focused. They can kind of be also like an excerpt from your longer manuscript. They're a good way to get your name out there. So absolutely, for myself, for my own journey, I published a chapbook before my full length. I published 5 chapbooks in general, but I thought that was more of an approachable medium before the full length. So yeah, absolutely, I would focus on that. Now, a full length can be anywhere beyond 50 pages. So the parameters are actually even wider. So I've seen full length manuscripts that are 60 pages, like a lean 60 pages, or I've seen manuscripts that are 300 pages. So anywhere in between those, mine land around 120 pages or so, but people think that that's kind of like long. But I don't care. I love being long-winded, as you can probably tell. So yeah, so that's the general lay of the land of the sequence is usually people place standalone poems, get the chapbook, and then they move on to the full length and place that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, let me look at the chat and make sure. Do I need a major in creative writing to succeed? No, absolutely not. I don't have one. I don't have a creative writing degree or major to succeed, even though I teach that in my university. But a lot of people do that have that as well. It really depends on you. I feel like writers are so different in terms of what works for you. For me, that wasn't of interest to me, and my scholarly work actually has always kind of fed my creativity and my creative brain. So that was the most useful to me. But Rachel, it depends on what kind of writer you are, So it really depends. Let me see other questions.
Jessica, I've
Yeah.
got a couple questions here that were skipped on accident.
Yeah.
The first one is from Jessica. All I'm seeing are free verse poems. Is there still a market for more rhyming poetry, and where? Thanks.
Yeah. You're right in that the kind of trend right now is more free verse. But however, there has been kind of a more bent towards form in general, not necessarily couplet rhyming form, but there's been a lot of popularity of sonnets, repopularization of sonnets. One person that I'd recommend in general to look into is Diane Seuss, who just won the Pulitzer, who put out a whole book of sonnets. Now these sonnets aren't in iambic pentameter. They aren't following a specific tight couplet focused rhyme scheme, but there is actually rhyme in it. It's just a little bit more unpredictable than the kind of canonical rhyme that you see. All to say that even though a poem isn't necessarily rhyming, that doesn't eliminate the kind of ear for music or sonic work that can happen. If you find yourself only writing rhyming poetry, I would almost kind of encourage you to like question why, or whether or not you know have tried other things. I do think that there is absolutely an ability to still do rhyming couplet rhyming poetry really well, but for the most part there's just so many other tools at play in the contemporary landscape, that can sometimes read as kind of cliche or tired, just to be like blunt and honest about it. So that's my advice for that. But in terms of form, sonic structure, those things have not fallen away. They are of utmost importance right now.
The other question quickly is, how do you feel about button poetry?
Button poetry, you know, doing great work. They have a lot of accessible videos online. All good. Yeah, all good. Yeah. I have love for fellow curators in any form.
There are still questions coming in. Jessica, totally up to you if you want to stay on a bit longer and answer them, and everyone else as well. We're happy to keep it rolling. But if you do need to leave, thank you so much for joining.
I have time for like a couple more questions.
Okay.
Just two.
Okay. So then I will give you, where is the best place to self-publish?
Well, I'm pretty like DIY about it, like in terms of like your printer. Your printer. I'm not one to ask about places that distribute on Amazon. I'm sure there's people in this crowd that are actually more well versed about it than me. When I say I self-publish, I do like zines off of copy printer paper, and I staple and I do it that way. You know, my brother printer is an amazing little beast, and it's cheap and it's accessible, and that works for me. But I know there are a lot of different kind of self-publishing avenues. I would just to say like be kind of careful with that, just because when business is tethered to the literary landscape, right, there are always opportunities for exploitation. So just be careful in terms of you're not pouring like your savings into putting your book out on Amazon that you're not sure is going to sell well. I just say that like just be careful out there, because there's just opportunities for exploitation, and that might not be the only way for you to see your book out there.
Awesome. And then the last question, is the process for pursuing publication for non-poems completely different than process for poems?
I'd say for standalone short stories and standalone creative nonfiction, it's pretty similar, actually. The difference, though, does come when you want to put out a novel or a full length of prose. That's a world that I don't have too much familiarity with, because it involves agents, literary agents, and finding a literary agent and crafting a pitch for your manuscript for the agent. So that's something that I'm not super well versed in. Yeah. But in terms of the standalone work and placing it, that actually looks pretty similar. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for being here, everybody. I hope it was helpful. And again, if you take anything from this workshop, I hope you understand that that rejection isn't personal, that if you can work towards this idea that your work, like a piece of clay that is being molded by a sculptor, doesn't have to be precious, that you can take it apart, that you can rethink it, that you can grow. And that's what I hope that you take from this. So thank you for your attention and for listening to my kind of congested voice. I appreciate you all, and good luck out there.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you everyone for joining. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.